The universe began not with light, but with a vast, undefined void. No sky, no earth, no gods, only raw existence without order or direction. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for being here. Tonight, we are going to follow the earliest recorded story of power in Greek mythology, step by step, exactly as it was described in the ancient sources. This is the story of how the first gods came into existence, how they ruled the cosmos, and how they were ultimately overthrown by their own children. In this journey, we will move chronologically, starting from chaos itself, through the birth of the Titans, the rise of Cronus, and the long chain of decisions that led to a war that reshaped the universe. We will follow causes and consequences, not symbols or metaphors. Each action mattered, because each action set the conditions for the next collapse of power. Few people realize how deliberate this process was. The fall of the Titans was not sudden, and it was not accidental. It was the result of fear, succession, and repeated attempts to control the future by force. And that raises a simple but critical question. How did the gods who created order in the universe become prisoners of it? Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. As we move through this story, notice how often power changes hands and what is lost each time it does. The universe began not with light, but with the vast, undefined void. No sky, no earth, no separation of forces, only existence without structure. In the earliest Greek accounts, this state is called chaos. This mattered because chaos was not a god and not a place, but a condition. An open gap or form had not yet emerged. Everything that followed was a response to this absence of order. From chaos came the first beings that gave structure to reality. The most important among them was Gaia, the earth. Gaia was not passive ground or empty land. She was a living entity with agency, capable of producing life without a partner. This mattered because Gaia became the foundation upon which all later power was built. Without her, there was no space for rule, conflict, or succession. Gaia soon gave birth to Uranus, the sky. Uranus did not merely exist above her. He covered her completely, enclosing the world and creating the first stable cosmic structure. Earth below, sky above. From their union came the first ruling generation of divine beings, the Titans. These were not minor figures. They represented fundamental aspects of reality and were destined to govern the cosmos. Among them were Oceanus, associated with a great encircling river; Hyperion, linked to light; Iapetus, ancestor of mortal men; and Rhea, who would later become central to the next transfer of power. The youngest of the Titans was Cronus. At these days, there was order, but it was fragile. Uranus, despite being the first ruler, feared his own offspring. Ancient sources describe him as hating some of his children and forcing them back into Gaia's body, imprisoning them within the earth. This mattered because it established the first recurring pattern of Greek myth, a ruler attempting to secure power by suppressing the next generation. The consequences were immediate. Gaia suffered under this confinement, both physically and symbolically. She was full of life that could not emerge. As a result, she decided that Uranus had to be removed from power. Gaia did not act alone. Instead, she sought an instrument and an agent. She fashioned a sickle from hard stone and presented it to her children, asking them to act against their father. Most of the Titans refused. They feared Uranus and the consequences of rebellion. Only one stepped forward: Cronus. This decision mattered because Cronus did not act out of justice or compassion, but out of ambition and opportunity. When Uranus descended to lie with Gaia, Cronus attacked, using the sickle to overthrow him. With that single act, Uranus' rule ended. This moment marked the first violent transfer of cosmic authority. Power changed hands, but fear did not disappear. Cronus took control of the universe, believing he had solved the problem of succession. In reality, he had only inherited it. The age of the Titans had begun, but it began with blood, betrayal, and the quiet warning that no ruler in this universe would ever be truly secure. After Cronus struck Uranus and removed him from power, the ancient tradition does not treat it as a clean, consequence-free victory. The act itself produced immediate results that shaped the world. In Hesiod's theogony, the blood of Uranus, falling onto Gaia, generated new beings associated with vengeance and conflict, including the Erinyes and the giants, as well as the Malaya nymphs, linked to ash trees. This mattered because the overthrow of the first ruler did not reset the universe into peace. It created a permanent layer of retaliation and violence that would keep resurfacing. The severed parts of Uranus, cast into the sea, are also said to have produced Aphrodite, who rose from sea foam. Even Ere, the pattern is consistent. A political act at the highest level of power produces new forces that no ruler fully controls. With Uranus removed, Cronus became the effective ruler of the cosmos, and this begins what later writers would call the Age of the Titans. In broad terms, later myth often remembers this as a time of relative stability, but the earliest accounts emphasize something else. Cronus ruled under a shadow. This mattered because Cronus had taken power through a family betrayal, and he understood what that method implied. He had proven that a son could overthrow a father. That knowledge immediately turned into fear of being treated the same way. As a result, succession became the central problem of his reign from the very start. Cronus took Rhea, one of the Titans, as his queen. Together they began producing children who would become the Olympian gods. Different sources vary on how quickly this happens and which details they emphasize, but the core sequence is consistent. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon are born first, and then Zeus. What matters most in the story is what Cronus does when these births begin. In Hesiod's version, Cronus receives a warning, often framed as a prophecy from Gaia and Uranus, that he will be overthrown by one of his own children. This mattered because the prophecy is not treated as vague symbolism. It is a specific prediction tied to family succession and political control. Cronus responds the way Uranus did. He attempts to prevent the future by force. So, as each child is born, Cronus swallows them. The story is literal. He takes the newborn and consumes it, keeping it inside his body so it cannot grow into a rival. This mattered because Cronus believes he is solving the succession problem permanently. But the action creates a new kind of crisis. Rhea is not simply losing children. The next generation is being trapped in a living prison. The household of the ruler becomes the site of the conflict, and the mother becomes the key figure who can change the outcome. By the time Rhea is pregnant again, the situation has reached its breaking point. She seeks help from Gaia, and the plan that follows is practical and direct. Hide the newborn, disable Cronus, and preserve one child long enough to challenge the system. And that raises the next factual question that drives the story forward. If Cronus swallowed every child, how did one survive, and how did that single survival lead to the war that ended the Titans' rule? Rhea's response to Cronus was not impulsive or symbolic. It was a calculated act meant to interrupt a cycle that had already repeated once in the history of the cosmos. With Gaia's guidance, Rhea left Cronus and traveled to the island of Crete, a location that later sources consistently associate with concealment and distance from Titan authority. This mattered because Cronus' power, while vast, was not omnipresent. The myth assumes limits to surveillance and control, even at the cosmic level. Crete functioned as a place outside his immediate reach. When Rhea gave birth to Zeus, the plan was executed immediately. Instead of presenting the newborn to Cronus, she wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and gave that to him instead. Cronus swallowed the stone without hesitation. This detail matters because it shows how fear had narrowed his judgment. He did not inspect what he consumed. His concern was not verification, but speed. He believed that by repeating the same action, he was maintaining control over the future. Meanwhile, Zeus was hidden and raised in secrecy. Ancient sources differ on the exact details of his upbringing. Some traditions say he was cared for by the nymphs Adrastea and Ida, while others emphasize the role of the goat Amalthea, whose milk sustained him. There are also accounts of armed dancers, the Curetes, who clashed their shields to drown out the sound of the infant's cries. These variations matter because they show a consistent concern across traditions. Concealment through noise, distance, and distraction. The survival of Zeus depended entirely on remaining unnoticed. As Zeus grew, the imbalance created by Cronus' actions became more severe. Cronus ruled, but his rule was built on containment rather than integration. His swallowed children did not cease to exist. They remained alive within him, suspended and inactive. This mattered because it created a situation where the next generation was preserved, not eliminated. Cronus had delayed succession, but he had not removed it. By the time Zeus reached maturity, the groundwork for confrontation was already in place. Zeus was not simply another child seeking power. He represented a structural correction to Cronus' method of rule. Sources suggest that Zeus returned in disguise, presenting himself to Cronus as a servant or cupbearer. This detail matters because it mirrors Cronus' earlier deception of Uranus. Once again, power is challenged, not through open force, but through proximity and trust. With Gaia's assistance, Zeus administered a substance to Cronus variously, described as an emetic that forced him to regurgitate what he had swallowed. One by one, Zeus' siblings emerged, fully grown and alive. This mattered because it instantly restored an entire generation of gods. In a single act, Cronus lost both his control mechanism and his monopoly on power. The act did not end the conflict. It began. The release of the Olympians created two clearly defined sides, each with a legitimate claim to rule, and made open war unavoidable. And at this point, the conflict stopped being domestic. What followed was not a rebellion, but a full-scale cosmic war that would last for years and permanently altered the structure of the universe. Once Zeus freed his siblings, the balance of power shifted, but it did not immediately result in open war. The newly released gods Ischia, Demeter, Hades, and Poseidon had spent their entire existence confined within Cronus. This mattered because, despite being fully grown, they had no experience ruling, organizing forces, or challenging authority. Zeus, although younger in birth order, had lived freely and developed independently. As a result, leadership within this emerging group naturally fell to him. The division between the two sides was now clear. On one side stood Cronus and the Titans, who remained loyal to him. These included powerful figures such as Iapetus, Zeus, Crius, and Hyperion. On the other side stood Zeus and his siblings, who would later be known as the Olympians. This mattered because the conflict was not Titans versus gods in a general sense. The Olympians were themselves gods, but a younger generation with a different model of authority. The war that followed was fundamentally about succession and governance, not morality. At this point, both sides began to prepare. Cronus retained control of much of the existing cosmic order. The Titans were older, physically imposing, and deeply entrenched in their domains. Zeus' faction, by contrast, had fewer numbers and less territory. What they possessed instead was flexibility. Zeus began forming alliances rather than relying solely on inherited power. This mattered because it marked a departure from the rule-by-containment strategy used by Uranus and Cronus. One of Zeus' most critical decisions was to seek out allies who had previously been suppressed by the Titans. Among these were the Cyclopus and the Hecatonchires, beings of immense strength whom Uranus and later Cronus had imprisoned. Zeus freed them, repeating the same corrective action he had taken with his siblings. This mattered because each act of liberation directly translated into military advantage. The Cyclopes, in particular, provided Zeus with weapons that became central to his authority: thunder, lightning, and the thunderbolt. These were not symbols. They were tools of enforcement. Meanwhile, the Titans consolidated their defenses. Cronus established Mount Athres as their stronghold, while Zeus and the Olympians operated from Mount Olympus. Geography mattered because it created two fixed centers of power. Control of space became as important as control of lineage. The war did not erupt instantly. According to tradition, it unfolded over 10 years. This duration matters because it emphasizes stalemate rather than swift victory. Neither side could overpower the other through brute force alone. During this period, the conflict escalated from isolated confrontations into sustained warfare. Mountains were used as weapons. The landscape itself was reshaped. Ancient sources describe the struggle as so violent that it threatened to return the universe to chaos. This mattered because it framed the war as existential. If neither side could decisively win, the structure of the cosmos itself was at risk. By the end of this phase, it had become clear that strength alone would not determine the outcome. The Titans had power, but Zeus had adaptability, allies, and a growing arsenal. The question that now drove the conflict forward was no longer whether war would happen, but how it would end and which vision of rule would survive it. As the war between the Titans and the Olympians continued, it became clear that this was not a conflict that could be resolved through isolated battles or displays of strength. The 10-year duration mentioned in ancient sources is not incidental. It indicates a prolonged stalemate in which both sides repeatedly tested each other's limits without achieving decisive control. This mattered because it exposed a weakness in the Titan model of power. Their authority had been inherited and centralized, but it was not adaptable under sustained pressure. The Titans fought largely as they always had, relying on their raw force, age, and established dominance over the cosmos. Cronus, as their leader, did not significantly alter his strategy over time. This mattered because his approach assumed that endurance alone would secure victory. The Olympians, however, were forced to evolve. Each failed engagement pushed Zeus to reassess how power could be applied more effectively. Over time, the conflict shifted from direct confrontation to strategic escalation. One of the most important developments during this phase was Zeus' increasing use of the weapons provided by the Cyclopes. Thunder and lightning were not simply destructive. They allowed Zeus to strike from a distance, altering the nature of combat itself. This mattered because it reduced the Titans' advantage in physical size and proximity-based strength. Power was no longer confined to direct contact. It could now be projected across space, reshaping battle dynamics. At the same time, the involvement of the Hecatonchires began to change the balance. These beings, each possessing 100 arms, were capable of overwhelming force on a scale neither side had previously deployed. Ancient accounts describe them hurling massive stones continuously, turning the battlefield into a sustained barrage rather than a sequence of individual clashes. This mattered because it introduced a form of warfare based on volume and persistence rather than singular dominance. The environment itself became unstable. Mountains were torn apart and used as weapons. The sky, sea, and earth were all affected by the conflict. Sources emphasize that the violence threatened to collapse the existing order of the universe. This detail matters because it reinforces the stakes of the war. A Titan victory would preserve an aging system built on suppression. An Olympian victory would establish a new order, but at the risk of total destruction if the transition failed. But these point loyalties among the Titans also began to fracture. Not all Titans were equally committed to Cronus' leadership. Some remained neutral or withdrew from direct engagement. This mattered because it weakened the unified front that had initially sustained Titan dominance. Zeus, by contrast, continued to consolidate leadership among the Olympians, reinforcing a hierarchy that allowed for coordination rather than fear-based compliance. As the war approached its critical phase, the outcome was still uncertain. The Titans retained immense strength, but they were increasingly reactive rather than decisive. The Olympians, though younger, were setting the terms of engagement. The conflict had reached a point where a final, overwhelming confrontation was inevitable. What remained unresolved was how victory would be enforced and what would be done with the defeated once the war finally ended. The final phase of the Titanomachy was not marked by a sudden revelation or a single heroic strike, but by accumulated pressure finally reaching a breaking point. After years of stalemate, Zeus and the Olympians began to coordinate their forces in a way the Titans never fully matched. This mattered because coordination, rather than raw strength, became the decisive factor. Zeus' command structure allowed different forces to act toward a shared objective instead of reacting independently to threats. With the Cyclopes supplying thunderbolts and the Hecatonchires maintaining constant assault, the Olympians were able to sustain momentum. The Titans, by contrast, were increasingly forced into defensive positions. Cronus' leadership did not adapt to this shift. His authority had always depended on fear and containment, and once those mechanisms failed, there was little left to reinforce loyalty or initiative among his allies. This mattered because power without adaptability proved insufficient under prolonged conflict. Ancient accounts describe the final confrontation as overwhelming in scale. Zeus unleashed sustained barrages of lightning, shaking both sky and earth. The Hecatonchires hurled massive stones without pause, preventing the Titans from regrouping. The imagery matters because it reflects a shift from individual duels to systemic domination. Victory was achieved not by defeating Titans one by one, but by collapsing their ability to function as a unified force. When the Titans were finally overcome, the war did not simply end. What followed was a critical decision point. Zeus now faced the same problem that had defined the reigns of Uranus and Cronus: how to secure power without creating the conditions for another cycle of rebellion. The immediate response was decisive punishment. The defeated Titans were bound and cast into Tartarus, a deep abyss used explicitly for containment. This mattered because Zeus chose imprisonment over execution, preserving the old generation while removing it from influence. The Hecatonchires were appointed as gods of Tartarus, ensuring that the Titans could not escape. This detail matters because it institutionalized the outcome of the war. Power was no longer maintained through personal fear alone, but through delegated enforcement. Zeus was not ruling by himself. He was building a system. With Cronus and the leading Titans removed, the Olympians emerged as the dominant ruling generation. However, the victory was not framed as absolute peace. The universe had survived the war, but it had been permanently altered by it. Mountains had been shattered, domains reassigned, and authority redistributed. The Olympians inherited not a blank slate, but a damaged structure that required stabilization. This moment marks the true transition from the age of the Titans to the age of the Olympians. But the story does not end with victory. The method Zeus used to win and the choices he made immediately afterwards set precedents that would define his rule. The question moving forward is not whether Zeus defeated the Titans, but whether his system of power would avoid the same failures that destroyed the generations before him. With the Titans defeated and confined to Tartarus, Zeus faced a problem that victory alone could not solve. The old order had been removed, but the structure of governance had not yet been fully defined. This mattered because Greek myth does not treat power as self-sustaining. Authority had to be organized, distributed, and enforced, or it would collapse back into conflict. Zeus' first task was not celebration, but consolidation. One of Zeus's earliest actions was to formally establish Mount Olympus as the center of divine authority. This location mattered because it functioned as both a physical and political boundary. Olympus was elevated, distant from the mortal world, and distinct from the former strongholds of the Titans. By choosing a new seat of power rather than occupying Mount Othrys, Zeus signaled a break from the previous regime rather than a continuation of it. Zeus then began dividing domains among his siblings. This was not presented as a symbolic gesture, but as an administrative necessity. Poseidon was given control over the seas, Hades over the underworld, and Zeus retained the sky and overall authority. Sources differ on whether this division was decided by lot or by agreement, but the outcome is consistent. This mattered because it prevented immediate rivalry. Each brother ruled a distinct realm, reducing overlap and competition. Hera's position also became defined during this phase. As Zeus' consort, she was elevated to Queen of the Gods. This mattered politically because it reinforced legitimacy through lineage and alliance. However, it also introduced internal tension into the Olympian order. Unlike earlier generations, Zeus's household would become a source of recurring conflict rather than stability. The seeds of future disputes were planted early. Beyond his immediate family, Zeus began integrating other deities into the Olympian system. Some titans, such as Themis and Mnemosyne, were not imprisoned and instead retained roles within the new order. This mattered because it showed that Zeus did not treat all members of the old generation as irredeemable threats. Loyalty and function mattered more than age. The new system was selective rather than absolute. At the same time, Zeus took steps to neutralize lingering dangers. Tartarus was reinforced as a permanent containment zone, guarded continuously. This mattered because it acknowledged a core lesson from earlier regimes. Defeated powers do not disappear on their own. They must be managed. Zeus's authority depended not only on his strength, but on maintaining control over what he had already subdued. By the end of this phase, a recognizable structure had emerged. The Olympians were no longer just a victorious faction. They were a ruling body with assigned roles, a central authority, and enforcement mechanisms. However, the system was still fragile. Zeus had solved the problem of succession in the short term, but the long-term consequences of centralized rule, divided loyalties, and personal relationships within power had yet to be tested. The next stage of the story focuses on exactly that tension, how the new order functioned once immediate threats were removed, and whether Zeus' system truly avoided the failures that destroyed the Titans or merely delayed them. Once the basic structure of Olympian rule was established, Zeus turned to the task of maintaining internal stability. Removing the Titans had eliminated the most obvious external threat, but it did not guarantee harmony among the gods themselves. This mattered because Greek myth consistently portrays power as vulnerable to internal fracture. Zeus' authority depended not only on force, but on preventing rivalries from escalating into open conflict. One of the earliest challenges came from Zeus' own behavior. Unlike Cronus, who attempted to control succession through direct suppression, Zeus sought to expand his influence through alliances and relationships. This included a series of unions with goddesses, titans, and mortal women. This mattered politically because each union produced offspring who carried claims to power, status, or divine function. Rather than eliminating potential rivals, Zeus multiplied them. These relationships had concrete consequences for the structure of Olympus. Deities such as Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Hermes, and others entered the Olympian system through unconventional births and complex parentage. Athena, for example, was said to be born directly from Zeus's head after he absorbed her mother. This mattered because Zeus had acted preemptively to avoid a prophecy that Metis' son would surpass him. The pattern is significant. Zeus used containment selectively, not universally, believing he could manage the risk. Hera's role became increasingly complicated during this phase. As Queen of the Gods, she was responsible for enforcing order within the divine household. However, Zeus' repeated infidelities undermined that authority. This mattered because domestic instability at the highest level of power created persistent tensions that spilled into the broader cosmic order. Many later myths, involving punishment, transformation, or divine intervention, trace directly back to these conflicts. Zeus also had to address challenges to his authority from other gods. Poseidon, in particular, occasionally resisted Zeus' supremacy, asserting his own power as ruler of the seas. Sources describe moments of rebellion or attempted coups, sometimes involving other Olympians. These events mattered because they show that Zeus's rule was not absolute by default. It had to be asserted and defended even within the ruling generation. To maintain control, Zeus relied on a combination of arbitration and enforcement. He positioned himself as the ultimate judge among gods and mortals, resolving disputes and imposing consequences. This mattered because it created a legal dimension to divine rule. Authority was no longer exercised solely through violence, but through decisions that established precedent. Despite these efforts, cracks in the system remained visible. The Olympian order was more flexible than the Titan regime, but it was also more complex. Multiple centers of influence existed, each with their own interests and ambitions. Zeus' ability to manage these tensions would determine whether the new order endured or collapsed like the ones before it. As the Olympian system matured, it faced its first serious test. Challenges, not from within the ruling family, but from forces that predated even the Titans. How Zeus responded to those threats would reveal whether his authority was truly stable or merely provisional. As the Olympian order settled into place, Zeus was confronted with threats that could not be resolved through family hierarchy or internal arbitration. These dangers came from forces that existed outside the Olympian system entirely, beings tied to the earliest layers of the cosmos. This mattered because it tested whether Zeus' authority extended beyond managing the gods themselves into the broader structure of the universe. One of the most significant of these threats was Typhon, a monstrous figure born from Gaia, often described as a last attempt to challenge Zeus' rule. Sources vary on Typhon's exact form, but consistently emphasizes scale and power. He was not a Titan, nor an Olympian, but something older and more chaotic. This mattered because Typhon represented resistance, not to Zeus personally, but to the idea of Olympian order itself. The confrontation between Zeus and Typhon was unlike the Titanomachy. This was not a prolonged war between factions, but a direct struggle for supremacy. In some accounts, Typhon initially gains the upper hand, temporarily disabling Zeus. This detail matters because it shows that Zeus' power, though significant, was not invulnerable. His authority had limits, and those limits could be exploited. Ultimately, Zeus defeats Typhon using sustained force. Often described as a combination of lightning and physical suppression, Typhon is buried beneath a mountain, commonly identified as Mount Etna. This mattered because it established a pattern Zeus would repeat. Rather than erasing threats entirely, he contained them within the physical world. Natural phenomena such as volcanic activity were later explained as signs of these suppressed forces still struggling beneath the surface. Following Typhon's defeat, Zeus moved to reinforce the boundaries of his rule. The universe was now clearly divided into ordered and contained spaces. Olympus functioned as the center of authority, Tartarus as the place of confinement, and the mortal world as a separate domain governed indirectly. This mattered because it created a stable cosmic geography that supported long-term rule. Zeus also formalized his role as enforcer of oaths and protector of social order. This function extended beyond the gods to mortals. Kings, laws, and justice systems were often depicted as operating under Zeus' oversight. This mattered because it tied divine authority to human structures, reinforcing Zeus' relevance and influence across different layers of existence. Despite these successes, the Olympian system remained inherently unstable. Containment delayed conflict, but it did not eliminate the underlying tensions that produced it. Gaia, who had facilitated multiple overthrows, remained active within the mythological framework. The forces that challenged Zeus were suppressed, not reconciled. Zeus had established dominance, defended it, and imposed structure on the cosmos. What remained was the long-term consequence of these choices. The final part of this act examines whether the Olympian order truly represented a new solution or whether it simply perfected the mechanisms that allowed power to endure longer without resolving its core contradictions. By the time Zeus had neutralized external threats like Typhon and stabilized the boundaries of the cosmos, the Olympian system appeared secure on the surface. Authority was centralized, domains were defined, and enforcement mechanisms were in place. This mattered because, unlike the reigns of Uranus and Cronus, Zeus' rule did not rely on a single tactic. It combined force, delegation, containment, and arbitration. In practical terms, it was the most sophisticated system of power the mythological universe had seen so far. However, stability did not mean resolution. The Olympian order depended heavily on Zeus' personal authority. This mattered because systems built around a single figure inherit that figure's vulnerabilities. Zeus' judgments, alliances, and conflicts directly shaped the behavior of gods and mortals alike. When Zeus intervened decisively, order was maintained. When he hesitated or acted inconsistently, tensions escalated. One of the defining features of Zeus' role was his role as guarantor of justice. He was invoked as the enforcer of oaths, the protector of guests, and the overseer of lawful conduct. This mattered because it framed Olympian power as legitimate rather than merely victorious. Yet this legitimacy was unevenly applied. Zeus' punishments were often severe when directed outward, but his own actions were not subject to the same constraints. That imbalance created resentment and cycles of retaliation that would recur throughout later myths. At the same time, Zeus's decision to preserve parts of the old order proved both effective and dangerous. Titans such as Themis and Mnemosyne continued to operate within the Olympian system, contributing to law, memory, and cultural continuity. This mattered because it anchored the new regime in the past, rather than isolating it from prior structures. But it also meant that older forces, with their own values and expectations, remained embedded within Olympian rule. The containment strategy that defined Zeus' approach binding enemies, rather than eliminating them, created long-term pressure. Tartarus held the Titans. Mountains buried primordial threats. These solutions worked, but only as long as vigilance was maintained. The mythological record repeatedly suggests that when attention waned, suppressed forces found ways to resurface. This mattered because it revealed the core truth of Zeus' system. It reduced instability, but it did not remove its source. By the end of this phase, the Olympian order had proven itself capable of surviving challenges that destroyed earlier regimes. Zeus had avoided immediate overthrow and established a model of governance that endured across generations. Yet the cost of that endurance was constant management, intervention, and suppression. Power no longer collapsed quickly, but it demanded perpetual maintenance. This sets the stage for the next development in the story. With the divine orders stabilized, attention shifts outward and downward to the creation, treatment, and fate of mortals. How the Olympian system extended its influence beyond the gods themselves would reveal whether Zeus' reign represented a balanced order or simply a more durable version of the same cycle of control. Once Zeus and the Olympians secured control of the cosmos, the focus of myth shifts toward a different kind of governance, how divine power relates to mortal life. This mattered because mortals were not treated as background. In Greek tradition, the human world becomes a testing ground for Olympian authority, where rules are enforced, alliances are formed, and punishments set examples. The gods did not simply rule from a distance. They intervened repeatedly, and those interventions shaped what mortals could become. A key element in this transition is the figure of Prometheus, a titan associated with forethought and planning. Prometheus is important here because he represents an older generation operating within the new order, not as a prisoner in Tartarus, but as an active agent with his own agenda. Sources vary by author, but a consistent outline emerges. Prometheus positions himself as a protector or a benefactor of humans, and his actions force Zeus to define what mortals are allowed to possess and what they must be denied. One of the earliest conflicts involves the division of a sacrificial offering. In Hesiod's account, Prometheus arranges two portions. One pile of meat hidden inside an unappealing container, and another pile of bones disguised with attractive fat. Zeus chooses the deceptive portion. This mattered because sacrifice was not just a religious act. It was an economic system linking mortals to the gods. The terms of sacrifice determined who received value and who performed labor. By manipulating that division, Prometheus challenged Zeus' authority over the human-divine contract. Zeus's response was not limited to anger. He imposed a restriction. He withheld fire from humans. This mattered because fire in ancient life is not a minor convenience. It enables cooking, metallurgy, protection, and organized settlement. Without it, humans remain dependent and technologically limited. Zeus' decision functioned as policy. It set a boundary for mortal development under Olympian rule. Prometheus then violated that boundary by stealing fire and giving it back to humans. Ancient accounts differ on the methasum, describe a hollow fennel stalk used to conceal the flame, but the key point is consistent. The action was deliberate, covert, and directly defiant. This mattered because it created the first major case in which a powerful being interfered with Zeus' governance of mortals. It was not rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It was an attempt to alter the human condition. Zeus answered with punishment on two levels. He targeted Prometheus personally and also targeted humans collectively. Prometheus was bound and subjected to ongoing torment, famously involving an eagle feeding on his liver, which regenerates. This mattered because it was not a simple execution. It was an example. Zeus was demonstrating that defiance would be met with sustained consequences, not quick endings. At the same time, Zeus initiated a second measure, aimed at humanity. The creation of Pandora. In Hesiod's framing, Pandora is presented as a gift that carries hidden harm. The details vary across later retellings, but the function is clear. This mattered because Zeus was not only controlling technology, he was shaping human social life desire, marriage, labor, and hardship, embedding vulnerability into mortal existence as part of the new order. The creation of Pandora marked a decisive shift in how Zeus exercised power over mortals. Unlike the punishment of Prometheus, which targeted a single defiant figure, Pandora was designed to affect humanity as a whole. This mattered because it showed that Zeus' authority extended beyond enforcement. Through force, he was shaping conditions under which human life would operate permanently. According to Hesiod, Pandora was crafted collaboratively by the Olympians. Hephaestus formed her body, Athena instructed her in skills and adornment, and other gods contributed traits intended to make her appealing and persuasive. This mattered because Pandora was not an accident or a side effect of divine conflict. She was a deliberate construction, engineered to function within human society. Her role was systemic, not individual. Pandora was given a sealed container. Later tradition often calls it a jar containing various afflictions. When the container was opened, these afflictions spread among humanity. The exact contents vary by source, but the outcome is consistent. Suffering, disease, labor, and hardship became permanent features of human existence. This mattered because the myth frames these conditions not as random misfortune, but as consequences of divine policy decisions. Importantly, hope remains inside the container in Hesiod's version. Scholars have debated whether this represents mercy or an additional form of control. But within the narrative structure, it functions as stabilization. This mattered because a world without hope would collapse entirely. By allowing hope to remain, Zeus ensured that mortals would continue to endure rather than resist outright. Endurance became a defining human trait under Olympian rule. At this point, the relationship between gods and mortals became clearly asymmetrical. Humans were capable of intelligence, planning, and social organization, but they operated under constraints imposed from above. Fire had been restored, but weak ghost. Knowledge existed, but with limits. This mattered because Zeus' system did not aim to eliminate human agency. It aimed to regulate it. Prometheus' continued punishment reinforced this framework. His torment was ongoing, not hidden. In later accounts, it becomes a known feature of the world, a reminder of what happens when boundaries are crossed. This mattered because myth functions as precedent. Mortals observing the gods' treatment of Prometheus learn not only fear, but the structure of authority itself. Zeus's actions during this phase established a model of indirect rule. Rather than constant intervention, he set conditions that governed outcomes. Humans would work suffer, reproduce, and hope within a framework that made rebellion unlikely and dependence unavoidable. This was governance through environment rather than constant enforcement. At the same time, the Olympians began interacting with mortals in more specific, localized ways. Gods favored certain cities, families, and individuals. These relationships mattered because they introduced selective privilege into the system. Zeus' rule was universal in theory, but differentiated in practice. Favor could elevate a mortal temporarily, while disfavor could destroy them. By the end of this stage, mortals were fully integrated into the Olympian order not as equals, but as participants whose lives reflected divine decisions. The system had expanded successfully beyond the gods themselves. However, this expansion introduced new risks. Mortals multiplied faster than gods, carried divine blood in some cases, and remembered injustice across generations. The next phase examines how those pressures produced heroes, conflicts, and challenges that would repeatedly test the limits of Zeus' control. As mortals became fully embedded within the Olympian system, a new category of figures began to emerge. Heroes. These individuals were not simply exceptional humans. In most cases, they were the result of direct interaction between gods and mortals, often through lineage. This mattered because heroes blurred the boundaries Zeus had tried to regulate. They possessed human limitations, but also carried divine traits that made them unpredictable. Many heroes traced their ancestry directly to Zeus himself. Figures such as Perseus, Heracles, and later heroes of epic tradition existed because Zeus repeatedly crossed the boundary he had established. This mattered because it created a structural contradiction in Olympian governance. Zeus sought to control mortal development, yet he personally introduced instability by producing offspring who did not fully belong to either realm. Heroes functioned as problem solvers within the system. They confronted monsters, founded cities, and resolved threats that the gods either could not or chose not to address directly. This mattered because it allowed the Olympians to maintain distance while still shaping outcomes in the human world. When a hero succeeded, divine order was reinforced. When a hero failed, the consequences served as warning. However, heroes also introduced risk. Their strength, ambition, and partial divine status made them capable of challenging boundaries. Heracles, for example, completed tasks that exceeded normal human capacity and directly interfered with divine domains, including the underworld. This mattered because it forced Zeus to continuously reassess how much autonomy heroes could be allowed without undermining divine authority. The existence of heroes also intensified heroes' role within the system. Many heroic figures were the result of Zeus' extramarital unions, and heroes' response is often punitive toward the mortals involved. Became a secondary enforcement mechanism. This mattered because it distributed discipline unevenly. Mortals experienced divine order not as a consistent legal framework, but as a network of personal consequences tied to divine relationships. At the societal level, heroic myths established expectations. Cities claimed descent from heroes. Kings justified authority through heroic lineage. This mattered because Olympian power became embedded in political structures on Earth. Divine rule no longer operated only through direct intervention. It operated through tradition, memory, and inherited status. Yet this integration came at a cost. Heroes often met violent or premature ends. Their stories rarely conclude with stability. This mattered because it reinforced a core message of the Olympian order. Proximity to divine power brings opportunity, but also danger. Mortals who approached the gods too closely were elevated temporarily, then removed. BT's stage Zeus system had expanded to include not only gods and mortals, but intermediary figures who carried both potential and risk. The system worked, but it required constant correction. Each generation of heroes tested its limits, revealing weaknesses that could not be permanently resolved. The next phase examines the long-term consequence of this arrangement. As heroic lineages multiplied and human societies grew more complex, Conflicts escalated beyond individual stories into collective disasters, wars, curses, and collapses that would expose the strain placed on the Olympian order by its own design. By the time heroic figures became central to the relationship between gods and mortals, the Olympian system had reached a critical level of complexity. Divine authority no longer operated only from Olympus downward. It now flowed through bloodlines, cities, alliances, and inherited obligations. This mattered because control was no longer centralized in practice. Even if Zeus remained supreme in theory, power had become distributed across many layers of existence. One consequence of this distribution was escalation. As heroes accumulated achievements, their actions began to affect entire regions rather than isolated communities. Slaying a monster, founding a city, or claiming a throne often displaced other groups and triggered retaliation. This mattered because localized divine interventions now produced large-scale human consequences. The Olympians were shaping history, not just individual fates. At the same time, divine favoritism intensified rivalry. Gods supported different heroes, cities, and dynasties. Athena favored Athens, Apollo supported certain royal lines, and Hera opposed those connected to Zeus' affairs. This mattered because divine conflict was now mirrored in human conflict. Mortal wars increasingly reflected disputes among the gods themselves, turning human populations into indirect participants in divine competition. Zeus attempted to manage this escalation through selective intervention. He imposed limits, issued warnings, and occasionally withdrew support entirely. However, these actions were inconsistent by necessity. This mattered because a fully predictable system would have eliminated divine leverage. Uncertainty became a tool of governance. Mortals never knew when aid would arrive or be withheld, reinforcing dependence. Yet uncertainty also bred resentment. Myths preserve numerous examples of mortals questioning divine justice, resisting fate, or attempting to circumvent the gods through cunning or force. This mattered because it demonstrated that the Olympian system, while durable, was not universally accepted. Compliance was widespread, but loyalty was not guaranteed. By this stage, Zeus' rule faced a new type of pressure. The threat was no longer primordial monsters or rival gods, but cumulative human consequence. Wars grew larger. Curses extended across generations. Entire cities were destroyed. Each event required divine response, drawing the gods deeper into mortal affairs and increasing the risk of systemic failure. The Olympian order had succeeded in stabilizing the cosmos after the fall of the Titans. It had even integrated mortals into its structure. But that integration created feedback loops that could not be fully controlled. The more the gods intervened, the more complex the world became. The less they intervened, the more disorder spread. This tension sets the stage for the next phase of the story, with mortals firmly embedded in the divine system and heroic lineages multiplying. The Olympians would soon confront conflict so vast that they could no longer be treated as isolated episodes. The next act turns to those large-scale catastrophist wars and collapses that tested whether Zeus' order could endure not just divine challenge, but the weight of history itself. By the time the Olympian system reached full maturity, conflict had shifted from isolated divine disputes to large-scale human catastrophe. This mattered because it revealed the structural limit in Zeus' model of governance. The system was effective at managing individual threats, but it struggled when consequences accumulated across generations and regions. The age that followed was defined not by creation or consolidation, but by breakdowns that required drastic intervention. One of the clearest expressions of this strain appears in the traditions surrounding the decline of humanity across successive ages. Hesiod describes a sequence of human eras: gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and Ionish, marked by moral and social deterioration. This mattered because the narrative frames human decline not as random decay, but as a response to changing conditions imposed by divine rule. The Olympians had shaped humanity, but they could not prevent its degradation. As human societies expanded, warfare became more frequent and more destructive. Conflicts were no longer limited to disputes between neighboring groups. They evolved into prolonged wars involving alliances, divine patrons, and cycles of revenge. This mattered because large-scale war reduced the gods' ability to manage outcomes through selective favor. Once violence escalated beyond a certain threshold, intervention produced unintended consequences. The Olympian response to these conditions was inconsistent. Some gods attempted to restrain human excess, others inflamed it. Zeus, positioned as ultimate arbiter, faced a dilemma. Constant intervention risked destabilizing the balance of divine authority. Non-intervention allowed destruction to spread. This mattered because it forced Zeus to consider solutions that went beyond punishment or guidance. One such solution appears in myths describing deliberate reduction of the human population. The most prominent example is the flood associated with Deucalion and Para. While details vary across sources, the core premise remains. Zeus judged humanity to be irredeemably corrupt and chose to erase most of it. This mattered because it marked a transition from corrective governance to reset-level intervention. The system was no longer being adjusted, it was being restarted. The flood myth also illustrates the limits of divine justice. Zeus preserved Deucalion and Pyrrha because of their piety. But survival did not equal restoration. Humanity after the flood was diminished, fragile, and burdened with memory of loss. This mattered because it showed that catastrophe could restore order only temporarily. The underlying dynamics of ambition, rivalry, and divine interference remained unchanged. As populations recovered, the same patterns re-emerged. Cities rose. Kings claimed divine descent. Gods favored sides. War followed. Each catastrophe reduced scale, but did not alter structure. This mattered because it exposed a recurring flaw in the Olympian approach. Zeus could destroy and rebuild, but he could not redesign the system without undermining his own authority. By the end of this phase, it was clear that catastrophe had become a tool of governance rather than a failure to govern. Destruction was used to manage excess, but at increasing cost. The next stage of the story examines the most famous of these catastrophes not as isolated legends, but as outcomes of a system stretched beyond its capacity to control what it had created. Among the large-scale disasters that defined this period, none illustrates the strain on the Olympian system more clearly than the sequence of events leading to the Trojan War. While often treated as heroic legend, the war functions in the mythological record as a convergence point for divine rivalry, human ambition, and accumulated grievance. This mattered because it showed how a system designed to manage individuals failed when entire societies became entangled in divine competition. The origins of the conflict were not military. They were administrative and political, a dispute among the gods over status and recognition, most famously represented by the judgment of Paraset. The conditions for war. This mattered because it demonstrated how minor divine rivalries could cascade into human catastrophe. The gods did not create the war directly. They created incentives that made it unavoidable. Once the conflict began, divine involvement intensified rather than restrained violence. Different Olympians supported opposing sides, providing aid, protection, or sabotage. This mattered because Zeus' role shifted from ruler to moderator. He did not prevent the war. Instead, he managed its progression, allowing destruction while maintaining a rough balance between factions. Authority was exercised through calibration, not prevention. Human leaders operated within this framework of divine influence. Kings interpreted success as favor and failure as punishment. This mattered because it reinforced dependency. Decisions were made not solely on strategy, but on perceived divine will. As a result, rational calculation and ritual compliance became inseparable. Warfare took on a religious dimension that prolonged conflict rather than resolving it. As the war dragged on, Its scale exceeded any corrective benefit it might have offered. Cities were destroyed, populations displaced, and entire lineages extinguished. This mattered because the Olympian system relied on continuity families, traditions, and memory to function. Large-scale destruction undermined those foundations. The gods were enforcing order by eroding the structures that sustained it. Zeus' attempts to limit the damage were partial and reactive. He intervened at critical moments, issuing decrees or enforcing temporary restraints, but he did not impose a comprehensive solution. This mattered because decisive intervention would have required overriding other gods entirely, destabilizing the balance of Olympian power. Zeus chose systemic preservation over human cost. When the war finally ended, it did not restore equilibrium. Survivors returned to ruined cities. Veterans carried trauma and resentment. Victors faced internal collapse. This mattered because catastrophe did not reset the system. It compounded instability. The divine order remained intact, but its credibility among mortals weakened. The Trojan War became a reference point for later generations, not as a warning successfully heeded, but as a precedent repeated. It showed that when divine governance intersected with human politics at scale, the result was prolonged destruction rather than resolution. This realization set the stage for further disasters, as neither gods nor mortals fundamentally altered their behavior in response. The next phase examines how repeated catastrophes transformed the relationship between Zeus and humanity from mutual dependence into increasing distance, skepticism, and withdrawal. As catastrophes accumulated, a noticeable shift occurred in how the Olympians related to humanity. Earlier myths emphasized frequent divine presence gods, walking among mortals, offering direct guidance, or enforcing boundaries personally. Over time, this proximity diminished. This mattered because distance became a response to overload. The Olympian system was no longer capable of managing the volume of consequences generated by its own interventions. Zeus, in particular, began to exercise authority through fewer but more consequential actions. Rather than constant involvement, he relied on omens, delegated enforcement, and irreversible judgments. This mattered because it reduced the flexibility that had once defined Olympian governance. Decisions carried greater weight precisely because they were rarer. However, rarity also meant reduced correction when outcomes went wrong. Human responses evolved accordingly. Mortals continued to perform rituals, build temples, and seek favor, but expectations changed. Divine justice was no longer assumed to be immediate or consistent. This mattered because belief shifted from interaction to interpretation. Humans began to read signs rather than receive instructions, increasing ambiguity and misalignment between divine intent and human action. Repeated disasters also altered how guilt and responsibility were assigned. Earlier myths often present clear transgressions, followed by punishment. In this later phase, suffering frequently exceeded identifiable causes. Cities fell despite piety. Innocence suffered alongside offenders. This mattered because it eroded the explanatory power of the Olympian system. When cause and consequence became opaque, compliance weakened. The gods themselves became more insular. Conflicts among Olympians did not disappear, but they increasingly played out within the divine sphere, rather than spilling openly into the mortal world. This mattered because it reduced collateral damage, but also reduced engagement. Mortals became subjects rather than participants in the divine order. Zeus's role as arbiter remained, but his judgments now prioritized long-term stability over immediate fairness. This mattered because it marked a philosophical shift. Justice was no longer about restoring balance after each offense. It was about preventing total collapse, even if that meant tolerating injustice at smaller scales. Batista states catastrophe was no longer an exceptional event. It was an accepted feature of the world. Floods, wars, plagues, and collapses were integrated into human expectation. This mattered because normalization reduced deterrence. Fear loses effectiveness when punishment becomes routine. The Olympian order had achieved durability, but at the cost of intimacy and clarity. Zeus ruled a world that functioned, but did not necessarily flourish. Mortals endured rather than trusted. Gods maintained authority rather than engagement. This transformation sets up the final movement of this act. If catastrophe could no longer correct behavior, and distance weakened influence, what remained of divine governance? The last part of this act examines how the Olympian system adapted to this impasse and what it chose to preserve when direct control was no longer effective. By the end of this period, catastrophe had become an accepted mechanism within the Olympian system, rather than an emergency response. Floods, wars, and collapses were no longer framed as failures of divine governance, but as tools used when other forms of control proved insufficient. This mattered because it signaled a fundamental shift in how Zeus maintained authority. Power was no longer exercised primarily through guidance or correction, but through periodic reduction. The effectiveness of this approach was limited. While large-scale destruction could temporarily restore balance, it also removed productive populations, weakened social structures, and erased accumulated knowledge. This mattered because the Olympian order depended on continuity to sustain worship, memory, and legitimacy. Each catastrophe reduced the very base that supported divine authority. The system survived, but it grew thinner with each reset. Zeus responded by narrowing the scope of his involvement. Rather than attempting to manage all outcomes, he allowed many events to unfold without intervention. This mattered because it marked a tacit admission of limits. Total control was no longer practical. Selective oversight became the norm. The gods intervened where outcomes threatened cosmic stability, not where suffering merely accumulated. This withdrawal did not mean abandonment. Divine presence persisted through institutions rather than appearances. Oracles, rituals, and inherited customs became the primary interfaces between gods and mortals. This mattered because authority was now mediated. Humans no longer expected direct action. They expected signs, interpretations, and delayed responses. Responsibility shifted downward, even as power remained above. At the same time, Zeus reinforced boundaries between divine and mortal spheres. Encounters became rarer. Transformations and punishments became less personalized. This mattered because it reduced unpredictable escalation. When gods and mortals interacted directly, consequences often spiraled beyond intention. Distance functioned as damage control. By stabilizing the system through distance and periodic catastrophe, Zeus preserved the Olympian order across generations. However, this stability came at a clear cost. The world was safer from total collapse, but it was also less responsive, less just, and less comprehensible to those living within it. Mortals learned to endure uncertainty rather than expect resolution. As this phase concludes, the Olympian system stands intact, but altered. To gods rule, but they rule from afar. Catastrophe remains possible, but it is no longer corrective in the way it once was. It is preventative, reducing scale rather than shaping behavior. This creates the conditions for the next development in the story. With direct governance weakened and catastrophe normalized, the Olympian order would increasingly rely on fate, prophecy, and inevitability to justify outcomes. The next act turns to that framework, how destiny replaced intervention as the primary explanation for why events unfolded as they did, and what that meant for both gods and mortals. As direct divine intervention became less frequent, another force moved to the center of the Greek mythological system. Fate. This mattered because fate did not replace the gods in terms of power, but it redefined the limits of that power. Zeus remained the supreme authority, yet even he was no longer portrayed as acting freely in every situation. Instead, outcomes were increasingly framed as fixed, inevitable, and resistant to interference. The most explicit representation of this shift appears in the figure of the Moirai, often called the Fates. These beings were responsible for determining the lifespan and destiny of gods and mortals alike. One spun the thread of life, another measured it, and the third cut it. This mattered because fate was no longer an abstract idea. It was personified, procedural, and impersonal. Once a thread was measured, even Zeus was constrained by it. Sources differ on whether Zeus controlled the fates, or merely respected their authority. This uncertainty matters. In some accounts, Zeus weighs destinies on a scale, choosing between outcomes. In others, he observes what has already been determined. The lack of a single authoritative version reflects a deeper tension in the system. Divine rule required limits to remain coherent. Without fate, Olympian power would be arbitrary. With fate, it became predictable, but also constrained. For mortals, the rise of fate altered how suffering and success were understood. Early myths often explained events as the result of divine favor or anger. In later narratives, outcomes are increasingly attributed to destiny. This mattered because it reduced the moral clarity of the system. If an event was fated, punishment and reward lost some of their explanatory force. Humans could act wisely or foolishly and still meet the same end. Zeus adapted to this framework rather than opposing it. He began to enforce fate rather than override it. This mattered because it allowed him to preserve authority while avoiding responsibility for every outcome. When tragedy occurred, it could be justified as inevitable rather than imposed. Fate became a stabilizing concept that absorbed blame without weakening divine legitimacy. The integration of fate also simplified governance. Instead of constant intervention, Zeus could allow events to unfold according to predetermined patterns. Intervention was reserved for moments where fate itself required enforcement. This mattered because it reduced the administrative burden of ruling an increasingly complex world. However, fate introduced a new kind of tension. Heroes and mortals often learned their destinies in advance through prophecy. Knowing what would happen did not prevent it. This mattered because it created a tragic structure unique to Greek myth. Action no longer aimed to change outcomes, but to understand or endure them. By placing fate at the center of explanation, the Olympian system achieved long-term durability. Authorities no longer depended on constant divine presence. It depended on inevitability. The question moving forward is how this framework affected behavior. Did fate discourage resistance, or did it provoke it? The next part examines how prophecy, foreknowledge, and human response interacted within a world governed less by intervention and more by inevitability. With fate established as a governing framework, prophecy became the primary mechanism through which destiny entered the human and divine worlds. This mattered because prophecy did not function as advice. It functioned as disclosure. When a prophecy appeared, it did not offer options. It revealed an outcome that would occur regardless of the actions taken to avoid it. The system no longer asked whether something should happen, only how it would unfold. Prophecies in Greek myth were often delivered indirectly through oracles such as Delphi. These messages were famously ambiguous, but the ambiguity did not weaken fate. It strengthened it. This mattered because uncertainty encouraged action while guaranteeing failure. Those who received prophecies attempted to outmaneuver them, and those attempts consistently became the means by which fate was fulfilled. Zeus's relationship with prophecy was pragmatic. He did not suppress it, even when outcomes were unfavorable. This mattered because prophecy reinforced the legitimacy of fate as a higher-order principle. When Zeus allowed prophecy to operate independently, he positioned himself as enforcer rather than originator. Authority shifted from decision-making to oversight. Human rulers were particularly vulnerable to this structure. Kings sought prophecies to secure power, but in doing so they bound themselves to outcomes they could not control. This mattered because governance became reactive. Leaders acted not on strategy alone, but on interpretation. Misinterpretation became as dangerous as disobedience. Heroes, who were already occupied an unstable position between divine and mortal realms, were especially affected. Many heroic narratives center on foreknown outcomes: premature death, betrayal, exile. This mattered because heroism was no longer defined by success, but by response. The measure of a hero shifted from achievement to endurance under unavoidable loss. Attempts to escape fate often involved extreme measures. Parents abandoned children. Rulers committed violence preemptively. Gods intervened selectively. Each attempt failed. This mattered because the system punished resistance, not by negation, but by actions taken to avoid fate became the instruments that carried it out. Zeus did not correct these outcomes. He allowed them. This mattered because it showed acceptance of systemic limits. Zeus' authority remained intact, precisely because he did not attempt to override inevitability. Intervention now risked contradiction rather than correction. For mortals, this produced a psychological shift. Responsibility remained, but control diminished. Individuals were accountable for their actions, but not for their outcomes. This mattered because ethics became internal rather than transactional. Right action no longer guaranteed reward. Wrong action no longer guaranteed punishment. By reinforcing faith through prophecy, the Olympian system achieved consistency at the expense of flexibility. Outcomes became predictable in structure, if not in detail. This stabilized cosmic order, but intensified human suffering by removing the possibility of escape. The next phase examines how this inevitability reshaped divine behavior itself. If even gods operated within fate, how did that constraint alter their decisions, conflicts, and long-term authority? As fate became the dominant explanatory framework, its influence extended beyond mortals and began to shape divine behavior more explicitly. This mattered because the gods were no longer portrayed as fully autonomous agents. Their decisions increasingly reflected awareness of limits they could not cross. Power remained vast, but it was no longer absolute in practice. Zeus's own conduct illustrates this shift. In earlier myths, he intervenes freely, reshaping outcomes through force or decree. In later traditions, his interventions are measured against what fate allows. This mattered because Zeus began to choose when not to act. Restraint became a form of authority. By allowing predetermined outcomes to unfold, Zeus preserved the coherence of the system even when those outcomes involved loss. Other Olympians responded in different ways. Some attempted to resist fate indirectly, favoring individuals or delaying outcomes. These efforts consistently failed. This mattered because it reinforced the hierarchy of principles. Divine will operated beneath fate, not above it. Even when gods sympathized with mortals, sympathy could not alter final outcomes. This constraint changed the nature of divine conflict. Disputes among gods no longer centered on who could impose their will absolutely. Instead, they revolved around influence within predetermined boundaries. This mattered because it reduced the scale of divine warfare. Large, destabilizing conflicts, like the Titanomachy, did not recur. Fate functioned as a ceiling on escalation. The enforcement of fate also altered how punishment was understood. When suffering occurred, it was not always framed as retribution. It was framed as fulfillment. This mattered because it detached suffering from moral judgment. Innocent figures could perish without implying guilt. The system no longer promised fairness, only order. For Zeus, this arrangement solved a long-standing problem. Earlier regimes collapsed because rulers attempted to eliminate succession threats. Fate removed that burden. If outcomes were fixed, anxiety over the future diminished. This mattered because Zeus did not need to suppress every potential rival. Fate would manage succession and consequence without constant enforcement. However, this reliance on inevitability introduced passivity. When disaster was foreseen, preparation replaced prevention. This mattered because it normalized tragedy. Knowledge of outcome did not motivate intervention, but resignation. The gods could justify inaction by appealing to fate's authority. Mortals internalized this posture. Acceptance became a virtue. Resistance was framed as ignorance rather than courage. This mattered because it stabilized behavior but reduced innovation. When outcomes are fixed, effort shifts from change to accommodation. BT stays. The Olympian system had achieved maximum durability. It no longer depended on continuous action. It depended on alignment with an impersonal structure that governed gods and mortals alike. Authority was preserved by consistency rather than control. The cost of this durability was distance. The gods were no longer seen as responsive partners in human affairs. They were custodians of inevitability. The final part of this act examines whether this framework ultimately strengthened Zeus. Rulor hollowed it out by removing purpose from power itself. By the end of this phase, fate had become the central organizing principle of the Greek mythological world. It no longer functioned as a background explanation, but as an active constraint shaping every major outcome. This mattered because the Olympian system now relied less on decision-making and more on compliance with inevitability. Power endured, but its purpose narrowed. Zeus's authority remained unquestioned, yet its character had changed. He was still the enforcer of order, but no longer its primary architect. Fate determined the broad structure. Zeus ensured that events unfolded according to that structure. This mattered because leadership had shifted from creative control to custodial maintenance. Zeus ruled a world whose future was already written. This arrangement resolved several systemic problems. Succession, anxiety diminished. Large-scale divine wars disappeared. The cosmos stabilized. This mattered because earlier regimes failed precisely due to uncontrolled escalation. Fate prevented that by imposing limits that no god could ignore. In terms of durability, the Olympian order reached its peak under this model. However, this stability came with clear drawbacks. Authority without discretion risks becoming hollow. When outcomes are fixed, intervention loses meaning. Zeus could punish or reward, but those actions rarely altered final results. This mattered because power traditionally derives its legitimacy from effect. When effect diminishes, legitimacy must rely on tradition rather than trust. For mortals, fate redefined responsibility. Humans were still accountable for choices, but not for consequences. This mattered because ethical behavior became internalized. Honor, endurance, and acceptance replaced expectation of reward. Greek tragedy reflects this shift repeatedly. Characters act correctly and still suffer. The system no longer promises justice. It promises coherence. The gods themselves became symbols of order rather than agents of change. Their personalities remained vivid, but their capacity to alter destiny was constrained. This mattered because it reduced the emotional immediacy of divine presence. Worship persisted, but intimacy declined. Gods were respected more than they were relied upon. At a structural level, fate solved the problem of governance by removing unpredictability. But unpredictability is also the source of vitality. This mattered because the Olympian order, Togstably, became static innovation slowed. New solutions were unnecessary when outcomes were fixed. As this act concludes, the Olympian system stands intact, orderly, and distant. Zeus has achieved what no ruler before him managed: enduring control without constant crises. Yet that control now depends on inevitability rather than engagement. Power has survived, but at the cost of flexibility and meaning. This sets the stage for the final act of the story. With the cosmos stabilized and fate entrenched, the question is no longer how Zeus gained power, but what that power ultimately amounts to. The final act examines the legacy of the Titan's fall and Zeus' long reign, what truly changed, what endured, and whether the cycle was broken or merely slowed. Or with fate firmly embedded as the governing framework of the cosmos, the Olympian order entered its longest and most stable phase. This mattered because longevity itself became evidence of success. Zeus had ruled longer than Uranus and Cronus combined, and the absence of large-scale divine overthrow suggested that the cycle of violent succession had, at least temporarily, been contained. The question now was not how power was seized, but what it left behind. One of the clearest indicators of this legacy is continuity. The Olympian gods remained in power across generations of mortals, without fundamental restructuring of the divine system. This mattered because earlier regimes collapsed precisely when continuity failed. The Zeus system did not eliminate conflict, but it prevented conflict from reaching existential scale. The Titans were bound. Primordial threats were buried. Fate constrained escalation. Together, these measures preserved order. However, continuity also exposed stagnation. The roles of the gods became fixed. Domains were inherited rather than contested. This mattered because innovation in governance largely ceased. Zeus did not redesign the system after stabilizing it. He maintained it. Power shifted from dynamic rule to preservation of an established structure. Stability replaced transformation as the primary goal. The memory of the Titans played a role in this preservation. Though imprisoned, the Titans were not erased from myth. Their existence served as a warning and a reference point. This mattered because it anchored the Olympian order in historical contrast. Zeus' legitimacy rested partly on being not Cronus. Even when he adopted similar containment strategies, the past was used to justify the present. Mortals absorbed this legacy through tradition and storytelling. Myths preserved the narrative of divine succession, catastrophe, and fate as explanations for why the world functioned as it did. This mattered because mythology became a form of institutional memory. It transmitted expectations rather than instructions. Humans learned what to endure, not what to change. At the same time, divine authority became less visible in daily life. Gods were still honored, but their presence was mediated through ritual rather than encounter. This mattered because distance reduced friction. Fewer direct interactions meant fewer unpredictable consequences. Zeus' rule benefited from this insulation, yet distance also reduced accountability. When outcomes were attributed to fate or ancient precedent, responsibility blurred. This mattered because legitimacy depends on clarity. Over time, divine authority became unquestioned not because it was just, but because it was assumed. The system endured, but it was no longer actively tested. As this phase unfolded, the Olympian order achieved what earlier powers could not. Endurance without constant upheaval. But endurance is not the same as resolution. The mechanisms that stabilized Zeus' ring containment, distance, and inevitability also limited its capacity to evolve. The next part examines this tension directly, whether the Olympian system truly broke the cycle of overthrow that defined earlier ages, or whether it merely slowed it by trading collapse for inertia. To assess whether Zeus truly broke the cycle of overthrow, it is necessary to examine how succession functioned under the Olympian order. Unlike Uranus and Cronus, Zeus did not attempt to prevent the rise of the next generation through total suppression. This mattered because fear-driven containment had been the direct cause of earlier collapses. Zeus' system approached succession differently, relying on distribution of power rather than elimination of rivals. Zeus produced many offspring, both divine and semi-divine, but he did not attempt to imprison or destroy them as a class. Instead, he absorbed them into the existing structure. Athena became a strategic ally rather than a rival. Apollo and Artemis were granted clear domains. Hermes functioned as an intermediary. This mattered because integration replaced exclusion. Potential threats were neutralized by assignment rather than removal. However, this integration was not without limits. Zeus remained vigilant against specific prophecies. When fate threatened his supremacy directly, as in the case of Metis' unborn son, Zeus acted preemptively. This mattered because it shows that fear of displacement never disappeared entirely. The difference was selectivity. Zeus intervened only when fate identified a clear risk, not as a general policy. This approach reduced the likelihood of rebellion, but did not eliminate tension. Several myths preserve moments when Olympians questioned or resisted Zeus' authority. These challenges did not escalate into war, but they mattered because they revealed underlying instability. The system functioned because Zeus responded decisively at critical moments, not because dissent vanished. Fate played a crucial role in managing succession anxiety. By framing outcomes as inevitable, fate removed the need for constant surveillance. This mattered because it allowed Zeus to tolerate ambiguity. Not every powerful offspring had to be monitored. Destiny would sort outcomes without direct action. In Titanomachy, fate functioned as an external regulator of succession. From a structural perspective, the Olympian order replaced cyclical overthrow with managed continuity. Power no longer reset violently. It persisted through adaptation and containment. This mattered because it transformed the nature of rule. Zeus was not the strongest god merely by force, but by occupying the position least vulnerable to for mortals observing this system. The lesson was clear. Authority could endure without justice, innovation, or intimacy, as long as it prevented collapse. This mattered because it shaped expectations. Stability became the highest value, outweighing fairness or responsiveness. Yet the cost of this stability was evident. When systems prioritize survival over renewal, stagnation follows. The Olympian order did not collapse, but it also did not progress. Its structures hardened. Its roles became fixed. Its capacity to respond creatively diminished. This tension defines Zeus' legacy. He succeeded where others failed, but his success came from restraint rather than resolution. The next part examines how this legacy affected the meaning of power itself, whether endurance without purpose can still be considered effective rule. As the Olympian system persisted without collapse, the meaning of power within that system began to shift. Earlier generations defined power through action, creation, overthrow, conquest, and reorganization. Under Zeus, power was increasingly defined through endurance. This mattered because endurance changes what authority is expected to do. Instead of producing outcomes, authority exists to prevent disruption. Zeus' rule exemplifies this transition. He rarely reshaped the cosmic order after its stabilization. Domains remained fixed. Hierarchies persisted. Conflicts were managed rather than resolved. This mattered because the system no longer sought improvement. It sought maintenance. Power functioned as preservation, not transformation. This change affected how justice operated. Earlier myths often framed punishment as corrective, restoring balance after a transgression. Under the mature Olympian order, punishment became deterrent rather than restorative. This mattered because consequences no longer aimed to repair harm, they aimed to prevent escalation. Justice became procedural, not moral. The role of fate reinforced this posture. When outcomes are inevitable, intervention loses urgency. This mattered because Zeus's authority no longer depended on responding to every injustice. It depended on ensuring that inevitability unfolded without destabilizing the system. Power shifted from engagement to oversight. For the gods, this meant fewer opportunities to assert individuality through decisive action. Olympians retained personalities and rivalries, but their actions were constrained by the need to preserve order. This mattered because divine identity became subordinate to systemic stability. Personal desire yielded to structural necessity. Mortals experienced this shift as distance and opacity. Divine authority was still present, but it was no longer dialogy. This mattered because interaction fosters accountability. When authority withdraws into inevitability, it becomes harder to challenge or understand. Mortals adapted by lowering expectations rather than demanding change. Mythology itself reflects this. Stories move from origin and upheaval toward tragedy and endurance. Heroes do not remake the world they endure. Italiano. This mattered because narrative function mirrors political structure. When power stagnates, stories emphasize survival rather than victory. From a systemic perspective, Zeus' reign solved the problem of collapse, but introduced a new problem: inertia. Systems that cannot collapse may also be unable to evolve. This mattered because unresolved tensions accumulate beneath the surface. Stability masks pressure rather than eliminating it. By stage, the Olympian order had become self-referential. It justified itself through its own longevity. The absence of overthrow was taken as proof of legitimacy. This mattered because legitimacy derived from survival rather than consent or justice. The question that emerges is not whether Zeus ruled effectively in practical terms. He did. The question is whether effectiveness without renewal constitutes success. The final part of this act addresses that question directly, examining whether the cycle of power truly ended or whether it was simply slowed to the point where its continuation became imperceptible. When viewed across the full arc of Greek myth, Zeus' reign represents neither a complete break from the past nor a simple repetition of it. Instead, it marks a transformation in how power functions over time. This mattered because the original cycle birth-overthrow, replacement did not disappear. It was neutralized through delay, containment, and structural reinforcement rather than eliminated through resolution. Unlike Uranus and Cronus, Zeus did not fall. But he also did not fundamentally resolve the fear that destroyed them. He managed fate, absorbed uncertainty. Distance reduced friction. Containment prevented rebellion from escalating. These measures worked. The Olympian order endured longer than any before it, yet endurance alone does not indicate closure. It indicates stabilization. The Titans remain imprisoned, not erased. Prophecies still exist. Even when they no longer trigger immediate panic, mortals continue to suffer outcomes they cannot alter. This mattered because the forces that once drove collapse were never removed. They were suppressed, delayed, or the system survived by narrowing the range of possible disruption. In practical terms, Zeus' success lies in redefining failure. Collapse was no longer the benchmark. Disorder became acceptable as long as it did not threaten the structure itself. This mattered because it lowered the standard of governance. Stability replaced justice. Continuity replaced renewal. Power became conservative in the strictest sense, oriented toward preservation rather than change. From the perspective of the cosmos, this was effective. The universe remained intact. Divine war did not recur. Fate ensured predictability, but from the perspective of meaning, the result is more ambiguous. Power that cannot evolve risks becoming self-authority persists because it exists, not because it improves conditions. Greek myth does not provide a final judgment on this outcome. It records the system as it stands. Zeus rules, the Olympians endure. Fate governs outcomes. Mortals live and die within constraints they did not choose. This mattered because the tradition does not resolve the tension it exposes, it preserves it. The fall of the Titans thus achieves something paradoxical. It ends the era of open overthrow, but it inaugurates an era of managed limitation. The cycle of power slows, but its logic remains. Fear of displacement becomes institutional. Control becomes systemic. Collapse is postponed indefinitely, not abolished. This is Zeus' legacy, not a perfect order, but a durable one. Not justice, but structure. Not freedom from the past, but insulation from its most destructive consequences. And with that, the long arc that began with chaos reaches its final form not in resolution, but in equilibrium. At this final stage, it is necessary to step back and evaluate the full sequence of events that began with chaos and culminated in Zeus' enduring rule. This matters because Greek mythology does not present history as a series of disconnected stories. It presents a continuous system in which each solution creates new constraints. The fall of the Titans was not an isolated revolution. It was a structural turning point that defined how power would function thereafter. The earliest order failed because it attempted absolute control. Uranus suppressed his offspring and created rebellion. Cronus repeated the same strategy with greater efficiency, but reached the same outcome. Zeus observed this pattern and altered the mechanism without changing the objective. He still sought to preserve power, but he no longer attempted to erase threats entirely. Instead, he distributed authority, delegated enforcement, and relied on fate to absorb uncertainty. This mattered because it transformed power from a reactive force into a managed system. From a practical standpoint, Zeus succeeded. His reign did not collapse. No younger generation overthrew him. The Olympian order endured across vast spans of mythic time. This mattered because endurance is the clearest measurable outcome in the mythological record, where earlier rulers failed quickly. Zeus remained. However, success in endurance does not equate to resolution. The core problem that destabilized earlier regimes' fear of displacement was not eliminated. It was institutionalized. Fate replaced paranoia as the primary regulator of succession. Distance replaced intimacy as a means of control. Containment replaced destruction. These were improvements in efficiency, not in purpose. The role of mortals highlights this distinction. Under Zeus' system, human suffering was no longer consistently framed as punishment for wrongdoing. It was framed as consequence, inevitability, or collateral effect. This mattered because it shifted responsibility away from divine decision. When outcomes are fated, authority is preserved, but accountability diffuses. Greek myth does not argue that this system is just. It records that it works. That distinction is critical. The Olympian order produces stability at the cost of clarity. Mortals learn to endure rather than expect correction. Gods govern through precedent rather than engagement. The world continues, but it does not necessarily improve. In T-Sensei, the fall of the Titans represents the end of violent transition, not the end of conflict. Conflict becomes embedded within the system rather than erupting against it. This mattered because it allowed Zeus' rule to persist without constant crisis, yet it also ensured that tension never fully disappeared. By the time fate dominates explanation and intervention recedes, power becomes Zeus no longer needs to prove authority through action. Authority is assumed because the structure remains intact. This is the final transformation of power in Greek myth. From force to rule to maintenance. The last question to address is whether this outcome represents progress or simply delay. The final part of this act considers that question directly, not as philosophy, but as a factual assessment of what truly changed between the age of the Titans and the age that followed. When comparing the age of the Titans with the Olympian era that followed, the most important difference is not moral quality, but structural outcome. This mattered because Greek mythology preserves results more than judgments. The Titans ruled and were overthrown. Zeus ruled and remained. That single contrast defines the entire arc. The methods Zeus used explained this outcome clearly. He divided authority instead of hoarding it. He integrated rivals instead of eliminating them. He institutionalized containment rather than relying on permanent violence. Most importantly, he allowed fate to absorb uncertainty that earlier rulers tried to suppress directly. These choices reduced volatility. They did not remove injustice, suffering, or conflict. They removed collapse. From a factual perspective, the cycle of overthrow ended because the conditions that enabled it were neutralized. Rebellion no longer escalated to total war. Succession no longer triggered panic. Power no longer depended on constant enforcement. This mattered because systems fail when they are forced to respond to every threat. Zeus' system endured because it chose which threats mattered. At the same time, this endurance carried a measurable cost. Innovation ceased. Resolution disappeared. The Olympian order did not solve the contradictions that destabilized earlier regimes. It managed them. Fate justified outcomes without correcting them. Distance reduced accountability. Authority persisted because alternatives were structurally blocked, not because conditions improved. This distinction matters because Greek myth does not portray the Olympian age as an ideal state. It portrays it as a functional one. Mortals continued to suffer. Wars continued to occur. Prophecies continued to unfold. What changed was scale. Nothing after the fall of the Titans threatened the structure of the cosmos itself. In that sense, Zeus' reign represents a shift from transformative power to administrative power. Earlier rulers reshaped the universe through decisive acts. Zeus preserved it through restraint. This is not presented as virtue or failure. It is presented as outcome. The Titans fell because they could not adapt to the consequences of their own fear. Zeus remained because he redesigned how fear operated within the system. He did not eliminate it. He distributed it across fate, distance, and precedent. The result was a world that could endure indefinitely without resolution. Greek mythology ends this arc without a final collapse, rebellion, or renewal. That absence is intentional. The story does not conclude with progress or redemption. It concludes with equilibrium. Power remains. The system holds. The cycle slows to the point where it becomes structure rather than motion. This is the final legacy of the Titans' fall. Not the triumph of justice, but the stabilization of authority. Not freedom from the past, but insulation from its most destructive outcomes. The world continues because it has learned how not to break, and that is where the story rests. Before you go, if you found this journey through Greek mythology useful, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. In the comments, tell us where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. One thing from this story that changed how you see the gods of Olympus. Thank you for staying until the end.